I can't count the number of times in my therapy office where one partner has yelled at another partner, either with their volume or with their tone, "You're not listening to me." And typically the partner's response is usually something like, "I've been sitting here for 15 minutes listening to you go on and on. I am listening." But you see, they were silent, but they weren't listening. And I imagine most of us know the experience of being listened to but not heard. It sucks. We know what it's like when someone sits silently beside us while we talk, but we know they're not actually listening to us. This happens all the time with my couples who find their way into my therapy room, and I actually think this is happening all over our society right now. I hear it specifically in the conversations that many of my friends are struggling with about who should be silent, how they should be silent, or if they should be silent. But I actually think that silence is the wrong word. I want to suggest that we should be less concerned about whether people are being appropriately or inappropriately silent, and more concerned with whether or not people are listening, more concerned with whether or not we are listening. So welcome back to Grounded Moments. I believe, and you hear me say this every episode, that we are at our best when we're grounded, when we are settled and secure in who we are, where we are, and what we're doing. Living, loving, and leading from groundedness takes intentionality, effort, and creativity, and it takes time. That's what we do in each Grounded Moments episode. We take a few minutes to slow down, to be present with ourselves, to be present with a thought or an idea, and to give ourselves space to settle, to get our feet on the ground so that we live, love, and lead from this place and not in pursuit of it. In this particular Grounded Moments episode, I'm going to take a few minutes and unpack what I think listening actually means and how it is absolutely not the same as silence. In fact, I'm going to show you 4 key elements that distinguish true listening from other things that we might call listening. So let's get into it then. The goal of listening, first and foremost, and this is really important, the goal of listening is for the speaker to feel heard. Right? So often in moments when we're listening, when we're trying to hear someone, there's all sorts of questions that go on in our mind to make sure that we truly understand what they're saying, things that don't make sense, things about what they say that's problematic. But we have to remember that when we're listening, what is primary of value, first and foremost, is that the person who is taking their time to share with us actually experiences being understood. Because let me tell you, I'm sure you know this, right, in your own experience. But actually sharing just about anything with anyone takes an element of vulnerability. It takes courage to, in some ways, expose either the feelings that we have or the ideas that we have and to share those with someone else, knowing that once we put them out there, who knows what's going to happen, right? Every time I do a podcast, every time I do a vlog, it actually is quite terrifying to me because there's this experience of vulnerability of, man, I'm sharing this, but I have no idea what anyone else is going to do with it. So I think when we're thinking about our partners, our marriages, our families, our children, the people in a society around us right now, all of the social tension that's going on, if we want to take listening seriously, then we have to start by remembering I'm not truly listening if the person I'm listening to doesn't walk away feeling heard. That is where it starts. Right? One of the challenges that comes up when we're actually trying to hear someone is when we start to begin to prepare our response to what they're saying before we've actually really heard them out. This shows up in my therapy room all the time. And actually, if I'm honest, like this is something that I do a lot. I'll be listening to my wife, I'll be listening to my friends, and I'm already evaluating what they've said. Right? I'm like, well, that's not quite right. Or like I'm almost preparing my argument or my response to them. And as soon as I make that shift, as soon as I'm in my head or in my experience getting ready to respond, I'm actually not listening anymore. I may still be silent. I may look like I'm listening, but I've actually stopped listening. Because listening first and foremost begins with the speaker experiencing being understood. I just want you to think for a moment of the things you're hearing going on around society. There's a lot of people talking. And actually, one of the phrases I hear a lot is this phrase like, I hear you. Like, I get you, I hear you. But so often that phrase is almost used to step people back to go like, hey, I hear you, you can stop talking now, let me respond. That's not listening. Often true listening gets us to the point where like, I hear you. And actually the speaker feels heard enough that they can actually stop and go, yeah, you do hear me. You do get me. Number two, listening requires curiosity. Right? This goes hand in hand with wanting the speaker to feel heard. And this also goes hand in hand with I can't be in my head preparing my response. That my job as a listener, in therapy we call this active listening, right? My job as a listener is actually to remain in a state of curiosity toward the person who's talking, right? It may sound like, I wonder what's motivating that phrase. I wonder why they're so intense or so mellow or withdrawn as they're having this conversation. I wonder if this is hard for them to be sharing this with me. I wonder what the experiences they've had that have led them to this place, that this is the hill that they're standing on, right? These are moments of curiosity, right? There's space in listening to actually be curious, to say like, hey, I heard you say that, but I don't think I understand. Can you explain that to me a little bit more? Right? Hey, I'm hearing you say this matters to you. Why does that matter to you? Not like, why does that matter to you? Like, I've got my response ready as to why that shouldn't matter, but why does that matter to you? Because I actually am curious, because possibly it doesn't matter to me the way that it matters to you. And I need to be curious about why it matters to you in a way that's different to me. So listening means that we ask good questions and we take time to understand the response, right? These are not for I do this and then I do this, like we check off boxes, but these build on each other, right? So I want the speaker to feel heard. And part of the speaker feeling heard is that I'm being curious in the midst of the conversation, that I'm taking time to ask questions and to understand the response that I'm getting to questions. Number three, curiosity requires empathy, right? So we hear listening requires curiosity. Curiosity requires empathy, right? Empathy is what allows us to actually get into our imagination of what the experience the other is having, right? This is not, as you're saying this, I'm imagining what it would be like for me to be in that moment. That's not empathy. That's my imagination. That's where sympathy comes in. Like I can get what this would feel like for me. Empathy is, I'm imagining you in that moment. I'm imagining you in that experience. And I'm actually trying to get into a bit of an understanding of what it's like for you to be you in that moment. And can I feel a little bit of what it means, what it's like for you to be you in that moment, right? Even if I don't know that moment for myself, if I can tap into empathy that I want to know their experience, that actually will breed the curiosity that becomes so important. And I can ask questions. I can take the time to slowly listen and understand what their response is. And this really builds on the person who's speaking feeling heard and feeling listened to, right? So the goal of listening is for the speaker to feel heard. Listening requires curiosity. Curiosity requires empathy. And empathy requires emotional regulation. This is a word maybe some people are familiar with, this idea of emotional regulation. Maybe some people aren't familiar with this idea. I did a four-part series earlier on with this podcast called Navigating Pain. If you want to unpack what dysregulation is and what regulation means and why it's important, I'd encourage you to go back and check out those episodes. But kind of in a nutshell, the reason empathy requires emotional regulation is I actually can't see someone else's experience if the whole time they're talking, I'm thinking about my own experience and why it's different and why they're wrong and why they're not seeing. And all of us have particular, some people might call them triggers. I like to talk about them being buttons that get pushed. All of us have places of reactivity that come up. And actually, if you think about the conversations that you probably get stuck in, in the relationships that you probably have the hardest time actually listening in, these are going to be conversations where our buttons get pushed and we actually end up in reactivity. We end up being emotionally dysregulated. So for me, right, what gets me every time, my buttons that I carry, you've probably heard me say this before, is in moments that feel unfair to me, in moments when I feel powerless, that I can't do anything about it, in moments when I feel like I failed or I'm failing or I'm about to fail, right? Those are three triggers for me that pull me right away from curiosity because it pulls me right out of empathy. I'm not paying attention. I'm in my own pain. This feels unfair. I feel powerless. And now what I do, and we all do different things to cope with those pain, that reactivity, right? I'll start to get snarky. I'll start to get passive aggressive, or I'll just start to back out of the conversation, right? None of those leave the person who's taking the time to share with me. None of these leave them the opportunity to feel heard. So if I'm going to be serious about listening, which is not being silent, right? Which is about being curious, about being empathetic and in their experience. I actually have to be able to identify moments when my pain comes up in conversations, when I get unsettled in conversations, when I start to react and now I'm emotionally dysregulated. And I have to be able to navigate that. I have to be able to grab a hold of my pain and do something different with it because otherwise I end up slinging pain back on people and I'm not listening to what is so important for me to hear. My own pain, my own emotional reactivity is fundamentally at odds with empathy. And if my pain and reactivity is high, it will be impossible to truly listen. So really what I'm saying, emotional regulation is important because emotional dysregulation or my pain actually blocks my view of you. So I have to be able to remove that pain that's blocking me in order to see you clearly so that I can listen. Right? So I want us to think for a moment about the relationships. I want you to think for a moment about the relationships in your life, particularly the ones that you struggle with, particularly the ones where conversations are hard, where you find yourself either frustrated and kind of amped up and getting angry or ready to start to back away. And I want you to see, can you identify what your emotional reactivity is? If you can't, go back and listen to those other podcasts. I think they'll really help you out. Because when we can identify our emotional reactivity, it allows us to step out of that and step into empathy, where we're actually imagining the other person's experience. And when we can step into empathy and begin to imagine their experience, it also allows us to start to be really curious. Why? How did that come to be? What do you mean by that? When we are able to engage in curiosity, right? This is an active listening. This is not silence. When we can be empathetic and curious, the person who's taking the time and taking the courage to share with us actually has a much higher likelihood of walking away from that conversation going, man, I really feel heard. I really feel like I mattered to that person, like they really listened to me. And if there's one thing that we need as a society right now, is for some of us, for all of us, to actually take the time to learn how to listen. We're not going to get anywhere if we can't learn how to listen to one another. I'll tell you that from my experience as a couples therapist. The longer the couples sit on my couch and they just keep talking at each other, that never resolves anywhere, that never builds connection. We never get anywhere. Things only change when at least one of them, it works best when both of them, but we can start with one of them. When one of them stops reacting and actually shifts to a place of empathetic, curious listening. So may that person be you. I don't want us to wait around for everyone else to start listening to us. Yes, we all want to be heard. I want to be heard. I want to be listened to. That's probably why I make a podcast. But we have to take responsibility to shift to become listeners because someone has to start it. Someone has to start listening. If no one's listening, we won't go anywhere. So I want to encourage you, if you've listened to this podcast and you've gotten here, take some time this week to think about this. Maybe listen to this podcast a couple times. Where do you break down in your listening? Where do you get stuck? What is your reactivity that comes up? So that you can start to shift into empathy and into curiosity and actually grow as a learner, that you might bring peace to those that are around you. So take care of yourself, be kind, practice listening, and we'll talk soon.